Welcome back, friends. It was a busy week of tournaments, and I got all the data here for you. So sit back, relax, and let's get to it. Just a quick reminder before we get started, we'll do the old YouTube pleasantries. If you like the video, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps push it out there for more people to see. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you get all my latest videos. And if you're looking for any other ways to help support the channel, I have a Patreon, patreon.com/warpfriends. Link is in the description below. Any help is greatly appreciated. All right, guys, let's get started. First thing we're going to look at for the week is the player numbers. So last week we had 1,115 players, and for the Dataslate we're sitting at 8,502. Games played last week we had 5,876, and for the Dataslate we're sitting at just under 44,460. And for the tournaments we had 12, bringing the Dataslate total up to 158. All right, and the first chart we're going to look at is the win percentage by armies for the previous week. So just a quick reminder, Games Workshop acceptable win rate is 45 to 55%. Anything in that range will be in green, anything 5% above or below will be in orange, and anything above or below that will be in red. So coming in, number 1 last week was Death Watch with 60%. Number 2 was Imperial Knights at 56. Sisters of Battle, number 3 at 54. Then we had Death Guard at 52.7, and Genestealer Cults at 52.4. Down at the bottom, we had Black Templars at 32.7. Then we had Orcs at 36.2, Space Marines at 37.8, Imperial Agents at 41.2, and then Tau at 41.9. So these arrows are here to show the change for each army versus the previous week, so you can get an idea if they did a little bit worse or a little bit better. All right, so Deathwatch pulled out a really good week, 60%. We'll get into a little bit later slides. They didn't have a ton of players, but those players who did show up did really well. Imperial Knights, of course, maintained right around the same as last week, which is really good at 56%. Sisters had a really good week as well, 54%. They just keep performing well week over week. It is a little bit one-sided with what detachment they're using, but they're getting some good results, which is more than we can say they've had in a long time. Space Wolf's new codex continues to perform pretty well, sitting around 52% this week, which is really good to see. Doesn't appear to be too overpowered, but it's just falling right kind of in the middle of the meta there, which is kind of what you want to see from each new codex. Down at the bottom is a little bit of a rough week for some armies. Space Marine, Orcs, and Black Templars all below 40%, and Orcs and Black Templars well below 40%. So there's definitely some armies struggling here in the current meta, and it's kind of getting worse each week. We're seeing more and more armies falling down below that like 40 or sitting around the 40. And we even have Leagues of Votann down at 43%. They've been doing pretty well recently, but they took a bit of a hit this week. So on the verge of getting their new codex, Grey Knights actually had a pretty good week at 51.9% as well, kind of sitting right around Space Wolves there. We'll see how that moves forward when the new codex gets released, but they have been struggling for a bit, so I don't know if the Grey Knight players sort of brought the armies out, sort of, stretch their legs and get used to it again before the codex drops, but they had a pretty good week. And overall, I think this week is kind of how it always looks, but we did have quite a few armies down at the bottom below 45%, a little bit more than usual, and especially 3 down below 40%. That's a little concerning. So the top half of the chart there, anywhere from like 50% and up, was a little bit more than we're used to seeing. A lot of armies sit around 52%. In previous weeks, we'd have Imperial Knights, Death Guard, and then Chaos Knights all sitting around 55, 56%. But now it's just one army up above 56%. I know Death Watch is up there, but you only have like 10 players is a little bit skewed. It's just not really indicative of sort of dominating the meta. It is a little bit surprising as well. Chaos Knights took quite a bit of a hit in the last couple of weeks. They're down around 48.5% this week, so they're falling off a little bit. I don't know if the people who were playing them sort of dropped them for other things, but after several good weeks of dominating, they've dropped down quite a bit. So next up is the army representation. So this is the percentage of players who play each army. So just a quick reminder, the average representation is about 3.7%. So if everyone played every army equally, they would be at about 3.6, 3.7%. So you just get an idea of how many players are playing each army. So number 1 there, we have Death Guard at 10.8%. Number 2 is Chaos Knights at 7. Imperial Knights at 6.5. Tyranids at 5.7. And then we have Space Marines at 5.1. And down at the bottom, we have Imperial Agents at 0.3. Death Watch at 0.7, Black Templars at 0.9, Grey Knights at 1, and AdMech at 1.3. So Death Guard maintains that top spot. They actually went up a little bit over last week, which is surprising because last week I think they were 10.2. So they're almost into that 11% range. Just keeps going. Every week I think that's the max they're going to get to, but every week they climb a little bit higher. Space Wolves is one of those armies that got a new codex, and they were down around like the low 2%, and now they're kind of creeping up week over week as the players come back. So it's good to see a little bit of life breathed into some of those factions at the bottom. They're down around 2.8% right now. We had 4 armies below 1%. Now, Grey Knights and Black Templars are both getting their codex here really soon, so that should help them a little bit moving forward. Death Watch, they did have a 60% win rate this week, but they only had 0.7% of the meta, like I said, so there's only like a handful of players for them, but of those handful, about half of them did really well. So they're not like as concerning as seeing Knights up there, because Knights is such a high population that they're actually like causing a lot of problems. Whereas Deathwatch, over all the tournaments that were played, there's only 10 of them basically, so they're not causing too much problem across the meta. Despite their struggles, Orcs and Tau still around 3%, which is not surprising. They're both popular armies, but you'd think they drop a little bit lower based on all the problems they've been having this entire data slate. And then up at the top there, we still have Tyranids at 5.7%, another army that's struggling but doing really well in the representation. And World Eaters, 4.9%, is another one of those armies that just got a codex. They're not, blowing the doors off, but they're just performing pretty averagely, but they're a very popular army, and sitting at 5% is pretty high in the representation there. And like I say every week, this is kind of how it always looks, very, very top heavy based on couple factors of strong performing armies and very popular armies. And then down the bottom, we have a lot of armies suffering, and it's a combination between sort of unpopular armies and ones that are just performing very poorly right now. All right, next up is the combined stats for previous weeks. So we have Army win rates, XOX1 percentage, and representation. So just a quick reminder, XOX1 percentage is the percentage of players who went 5-0 or 4-1 at a tournament. It's not a perfect stat, but it's just a good way to sort of combine it with win percentage to see how the army is doing. The higher the XOX1 percentage, the more chance you're going to see that army at the top tables and a better chance to win tournaments. And the lower percentage, more likely you're going to see them at the bottom tables and just kind of struggling overall. So going in number one, we had Deathwatch, and then we had Grey Knights, Imperial Knights, Genestealer Cults, and Death Guard. And then down at the bottom, we had Black Templars, Agents, Orcs, Space Marines, and Drukhari. So like I mentioned, Deathwatch is number one, but they are kind of coasting high on the 50% XOX1. They only had a handful of players, 0.7% of the meta, so 2 or 3 of those players did really well. It's going to spike those numbers way up. So they had a really good week, but it's not as concerning as, say, Imperial Knights at number 3, which has 6.5% of the meta and a 26% XOX1. So that's a lot of Imperial Knights players, and a quarter of them are doing very well, which is more oppressive on the meta than, say, Grey Knights or Deathwatch, who did well this week, where it's just a select couple players. Then you go down to Death Guard, who had a little bit of a down week comparative to what they normally are. They're normally sitting around like 20, 25% XOX1. This week they're only at 17%. It's right around the meta average, a little bit above, but it is a bit of a dip versus some previous weeks, so I don't know exactly what's going on there, but as more and more players keep filtering into the faction, it could get watered down a little bit based off of, people who aren't as experienced or, new to the faction and just not quite as good as some of the people who've been playing it for a while. So Sisters had a really good week. They're just kind of held back by their representation at 2.6%, but they had 20% XOX1, so really good performance across the board from all the Sisters players there. And then you look down the bottom there and you had a lot of armies below 10%. You have Tyranids, you have Admech, Votann, Drukhari, Space Marines, Orcs, Agents, and Black Templars. That's a huge number of armies that struggled to even get 10% of their players to perform well. And even Chaos Knights are actually in that. They have only a 9% XOX1. So they had quite a bit of a fall this week. And a lot of these armies are kind of up and down week over week. You have Drukhari. Some weeks they do really well. Some weeks they do really poorly. Space Marines have been kind of struggling. Orcs have been kind of struggling. Black Templars have had a couple decent weeks here and there. And so Votann have been performing pretty well this entire data slate, but they've kind of dropped down a little bit in the last couple of weeks. They do have all those new models up for pre-order, and the codex should be coming out soon, so that should hopefully help them out a little bit, but they normally have been performing pretty well. This chart, as I say every time, it looks the same. The top is very top heavy. I mean, this week's a little more skewed just because of how the Deathwatch players did, but overall, there's 4 or 5 armies sort of doing all the work, and then there's 5 or 6 armies at the bottom who are barely doing anything at all when it comes to being competitive at the top tables and chance to win a tournament. So it is very unfortunate that this is how it looks in the current meta, but we have a lot of codexes being released and we have a lot of codexes coming up. So it's going to be a bit of a ride, I think, until everything sort of smooths themselves out here. And next we're going to look at is the tournament wins for each army last week. So Imperial Knights had the most last week with 4. Then we had Death Guard with 3. Tau had 1, Space Marines had 1, Genestealers had 1, Deathwatch and Astra Militarum both had 1. So Imperial Knights take over the top spot with 4, just beating out Death Guard, who got 3. Even though Death Guard did sort of struggle statistics-wise compared to their previous weeks, they still managed to pull out 3 tournament wins, which is not surprising because they're winning most of the tournaments out there. So Tau and Space Marines, despite their struggles they faced last week, they both got a tournament win, which is nice to see. Deathwatch, not surprising. They had some really good results, so one of those few players who performed really well ended up winning a tournament. And next up is the tournament wins for each sub-faction. So we just kind of break down how each army got their wins. So, of course, for Imperial Knights, it was all Noble Lance. Death Guard was split between 3 different sub-factions. We have Virulent Victorium, Mortarian's Hammer, and Champions of Contagion. And then Tau won their tournament this week with the Experimental Prototype Cadre. Last time they won, it was with Kroot. So they're just kind of pulling out their wins across some different detachments there. All right, next up is the Army win percentages for the current data slate. So this is the last 9 weeks of data here. So coming in number 1 is Imperial Knights at 56.5%. And then we have Death Guard at 54.4%. Chaos Knights at 52.7%, and then we have Gene Stealers at 52.5%, and Thousand Sons at 51.8%. And then down at the bottom, we have Agents at 32%, Orcs at 41.2%, Space Marines at 42.9%, Grey Knights at 44.3%, and Tau at 44.8%. So not much has changed. Everything, a couple armies flop back and forth here and there, but for the most part, this looked this way for the entire data slate. I think Black Templars and Tau both dropped below 45% this week because they had some poor weeks. They're sort of teetering back and forth depending on how they do. Space Marines and Orcs keep kind of dropping closer and closer to 40%, which is a little bit concerning there, considering how poor you have to do to kind of get 40% across the entire data slate. So those are some armies that are in some desperate need of some help there. Because we're 9 weeks in, not much is really going to change week over week. It's kind of set in stone as it is. You might see a little flip-flopping here and there based on how an army does each week over week. But for the most part, this is how it's going to look. And we have a lot of armies at the top that are above 50%. And you would like to see that 50% closer to the middle. But you'd like to see that variance between sort of the top and bottom be much smaller. You don't want the swing to be almost a 15% difference between number 1 and the last place. Agents is very hit or miss because they have so few players, but like if you compare Orcs and Imperial Knights, there's a 13, almost 14% difference in win percentage there, which is a extremely high variance between the two. It's one of the worst we've seen in a while, and the fact that it's not just one army down there, we have several armies down that below 45%. It's very concerning, and like I said in the previous slides there, Games Workshop has their work cut out for them. They are sort of releasing a lot of codexes very fast here. We've had, in the last several months, we've, and including the ones coming up here recently, it's like 6-7 codexes it feels like it's coming out. And that's a lot of new rules and new variances to implement into the meta. So hopefully the new data slate that comes out in a couple weeks here will add a little bit of a balance and sort of help fix this stuff. But with everything they're doing and the speed at which they're going, you're going to see a lot of variances and some issues crop up because of that. All right, next up is the army representation for the current data slate. So just a quick reminder, the average is about 3.7%. So if everyone played every army equally, it would all be about 3.6, 3.7%. So at the top there, we have Death Guard at 9.2%, Imperial Knights at 6.3%, then we have Tyranids at 5.5%, Chaos Knights at 5.3%, and Space Marines at 5.1%. And then down at the bottom, we have Agents at 0.2%, Death Watch at 0.9%, Black Templars at 0.9%, AdMech at 1.4, and Grey Knights at 1.5. So this chart is just getting a little bit repetitive. Unfortunately, it just kind of looks the same as it does every week. Like the win percentage, an army might flip here and there, 4.9, 4.8, and sort of drop up and down one slot. But for the most part, it's going to look like this. Death Guard just keeps getting more players each week. Knights keeps getting more players. Tyranids, Chaos Knights, and Space Marines are all very popular. And then down at the bottom, you have armies that are struggling. The only thing that might help this is an army that gets a codex release. So you see Space Wolves, they're creeping up to like 2.1, 2.2, but it's so far into the data slate now that you'd need a massive few weeks for Space Wolves to even jump up, a couple point percentages. Like they're not going to make it into the 3s, even if they maintain a decent army rep for the rest of the data slate, just because 9 weeks of data is just, there's a lot of numbers there, and it's a little bit hard to overcome at this point. So unfortunately, this was one of the more skewed data slates when it comes to players and what they're playing. Now is also one of the data slates that had some of the more broken armies consistently across the data slate with, Death Guard, Imperial Knights, and to a lesser extent, but still up there, Chaos Knights, causing a lot of issues. So it's not surprising to see the results that we've seen. All right, next up is the combined stats for the previous week. So we have Army win rates, XOX win percentage, and representation. Just a quick reminder, XOX win percentage is the percentage of players who went 5-0 or 4-1 at a tournament. It's not a perfect stat, but it's a good way to kind of look at the power of the army and compare it to the win percentage. The higher the XOX win percentage, the more chance you're going to see those armies at the top tables, and they're going to have a better chance of winning tournaments on average. So coming in number 1, we have Knights. Number 2, we have Death Guard. We have Thousand Sons at number 3, Sisters of Battle number 4, and Gene Stealers number 5. Then down at the bottom, we have Agents, Black Templars, Orcs, Grey Knights, and Adeptus Mechanicus. So Death Guard and Knights are leagues above everyone else. Their win percentage is way above everyone else. Their XOX1 percentage is extremely high, and their representation is massive compared to most armies. So there's no surprise that they're dominating the meta, based on everything we've seen, tournament wins and win percentage week over week and everything like that. It's not surprising to see them up that high. Thousand Suns, they've been performing just very well. They got that new codex, and it's not, breaking anything, but they're performing a little bit above the average across the board. So, while they're not winning a ton of tournaments, they are getting some good results on average. And same can go for Sisters. Well, they didn't get to new codex. They are finally performing better after some recent changes in the last data slate. So Chaos Knights has kind of fallen off a little bit in the last few weeks. They have a very high representation, but their XOX1 is around 17%. While it might seem low compared to their Imperial cousins there, it is actually a much better place to be in. You want to be around like 15 to 18%. That's more the meta average, and it's a much healthier spot to be in, but it definitely doesn't feel as good when you just got a codex and all the Imperial Knights got was the datasheet changes that you got, and they're performing way better than you are, and they don't even have their new codex yet. Down at the bottom there, we have several armies with sub 10% XOX1, AdMech, Grey Knights, Orcs, Templars. Now, Grey Knights and Templars are both getting a codex soon, but like I said, there's so much data already sort of put into this that it won't really affect them too much for the rest of this data slate, so they're going to kind of live at the bottom there, but hopefully moving forward into the next data slate, we'll see them up around the meta average in a much better spot. So the chart looks like it always does. We have a few armies at the top who are sort of causing problems for everyone else, and everyone else is either just sort of treading water around the average or suffering way below the average. And now we have the Army tournament wins for the current data slate. And this is broken down week over week, so each color represents a different week, so you can get an idea of when each army is winning all their tournaments. So coming in number 1, we have Death Guard at 31. Imperial Knights is number 2 at 17. Then we have Chaos Knights with 12 and Aeldari with 12. And then we have World Eaters with 10. And then Asher Militarum and Genestealer Cults both with 8. Despite Tao's poor results, they've actually won 5 tournaments, which is kind of surprising based on, their XOX1 percentage and the win percentage for the data slate. But some of those loyal Tau players are managing to pull out some wins. That's good to see. World Eaters, they've slowed down since the Codex released. For the first, half of the data slate, they were winning a lot of tournaments each week. So they've kind of trailed off since the data slate release. They've only won 1 tournament in the last 4 weeks. So they're kind of settling into sort of where they kind of fit into the meta there and what you can kind of expect moving forward. And overall, it's, looks how every other chart looks. Very skewed at the top. Death Guard sort of just bullying everybody with 31 tournament wins. And then we have poor Space Wolves and Agents down at the bottom who haven't picked up one yet. All right, for the first faction focus this week, we're going to look at Chaos Space Marines. So looking at the previous 8 weeks of results there, we can see that their win percentage is kind of maintained around 45 to 50% with a couple little dips here and there, but not too bad overall, pretty consistently within that sort of average where you want to be. And their army representation has been anywhere from 3 to 4.5%. So again, right between those averages of about 3.7%. So overall, their results, it's been up and down week over week, but they're kind of maintaining right around, if you look at the whole, right around the meta average. So you look at their stats versus the meta average, they're actually performing pretty consistent across the board here. Their win percentage is a couple percentages below the average, 46.9 versus 48.7. Their army rep is almost bang on the average, 3.5 versus 3.6. XOX1 is 0.5% below, 15.7 and 16.2, and they've won 6 tournaments and the average is 5.9. So overall, Chaos Space Marine's performance against the rest of the meta is actually almost perfect. Looking at the stats here, they're actually one of the more balanced armies right now. If you look at their sub-faction player count, you can see Renegade Raiders is the more popular army at 37%. You have Pact Band Zealots at 25%, and then you have Creations of Bile coming in at about 13%. And everything else making up the rest there. Looking at the sub-factions win percentage data there, you can see that Renegade Raiders had a 54% win rate, so that's pretty good considering that is the highest faction being represented there, so that kind of makes sense. Chaos Gold had a 59% win rate, but their representation is only 3%, so not very many players there, but the ones who did play performed pretty well, but you kind of take that data with a little bit of a grain of salt. And then overall, every other detachment is around 48 to 40%, with a couple falling down below 40% there. But there's some of the detachments who get very little play. So out of their 6 tournament wins, Renegade Raiders has 5, and then Pact-Bound Zealots have 1. So overall, I think Chaos Space Marines is in a pretty good spot. They're kind of forgotten about a little bit. No one really talks about them much anymore. They're still a popular army, and they're performing pretty well. But I think overall, they're just kind of flying under the radar, performing right around the meta average. And that kind of happens when you do that. People... You're not really polarizing, so people aren't really mad at you or upset at you for performing poorly or want you to do better or get buffs or nerfs or anything. So you just kind of slide in there and perform well and perform average. And if every army was close to these guys, we'd be in a much better spot. This next faction focus is Space Marines, so I thought I would look at the Imperial version of the Chaos Space Marines here. So looking at the last 8 weeks of data there, we can see their win percentage is anywhere from 40 to 46, 45%. They've had a couple outliers here and there, but for the most part, they've been between 40 to 45%. And you look at their representation over the last 8 weeks is anywhere from like 4% to 6%, but falling right around 5% is the average there. So they're getting a lot of people showing up to play them, as always. They're one of the more popular armies, but their win percentage has been suffering quite a bit lately. So despite their poor results, they're still getting a lot of players. And then we look at the stats versus the meta average. You can see that their win percentage is considerably below the meta average at 42.9 versus 48.7. Their army representation is quite a bit higher at 5.1 versus 3.6. Their XOX1 is 10.8 versus 16.2, and they have 4 tournament wins versus 6 for the meta average. So overall, Space Marines are kind of in a rough spot. Their win percentage and their XOX1 percentage is suffering quite a bit. They are a very popular army, so they're always going to have high rep, and they have some loyal players and some good players who play them, and they're still pulling out some tournament wins here and there. It is an army that lends itself to more of the newer crowd and more of the people who are just sort of getting into the hobby and maybe trying tournaments out or not really super experienced, just due to the fact that sort of the intro army, and it's what pulls most people into the setting. So, you know, that could be a little bit of a part of it, but I still think they're in a little bit of a bad spot, and they definitely need some help. They have been performing pretty well this edition sometimes, and they've been performing pretty poorly. They made some changes to Oath a couple times that sort of helped them and then hurt them. So maybe they can get a little bit of love here and hopefully just buff them and not end up buffing all of the other Space Marine chapters that sort of piggyback off their rules as well, because that can cause some problems down the line. If you look at their subfaction player count, you can see Gladius Task Force is 53% of the players. And then we have Firestorm Assault at 14, and then we have Ironstorm at 9.5, Vanguard at 9.3. So fairly broken down evenly across the other subfactions, except for Gladius, who is clearly the favorite at 53%. Looking at the subfaction win percentage there, you can see Gladius is at 43.4%. I mean, they don't have a single detachment over 50% win rate, except for the Ultramarines detachment, but there's only, I think, one Ultramarines player for the entire data slate, so you kind of have to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. Librarius Conclave was one of the new ones they got, and that's almost 30%. You have First Company is almost 34%, and then everything else is right around 40 to 45, 48%. So across the board, they're suffering. There's really not one detachment that's kind of like the saving grace for them and giving them, boosting their win percentage a little bit like you see with some factions. But overall, I think they're just in a pretty rough spot, and they could definitely use some love across the board there and maybe help a few detachments out and give them, breathe a little life into them. Looking at their subfaction tournament wins there, you have Stormlance with 2, we have Gladius with 1, and then Firestorm with 1. So a little bit of a split between the tournament wins there, but overall, Space Marines are definitely suffering right now. In a bit of a rough spot with a lot of other armies. So Dataslate is coming up soon. So if there's any Space Marine players out there, let me know what you think should be changed to sort of bring them back into relevance and sort of bring them back up closer to the meta average. All right, guys, and that's it for this week. Thanks for watching. Big shout out to my Patreon members, Meet the Great, John Gurman, William Viz, Darby Conrad, and my YouTube channel members, Andrew Stone. If you guys want to join them, become one of my Patreons or channel members, you can go to patreon.com/warpfriends, link is in the description below, or you can check out the YouTube channel and become a member there. I appreciate all your guys' support. Good luck in the tournaments coming up next weekend, and I'll see you next week.